Okay, so welcome back to part 2 in this video, going into the background on William Shakespeare. So in the previous video we looked at all of Shakespeare's own biography, his own personal story and his life trajectory. In this video we're going to take a look at the historical backdrop of William Shakespeare. So let me see if I can pull up bit paper again. Okay, so we touched upon this last time, but generally speaking, it's kind of convenient to divide Shakespeare's life into kind of two periods, really. We have the Elizabethan period, and then the Jacobean period. So Queen Elizabeth and King James, and those are the two periods. This really was a great period in English history, really. I mean, there was a lot happening, but under Queen Elizabeth, I suppose probably the main thing that grew was the English naval influence. So there was the growth of the kind of official national navy, but Elizabeth also sponsored the likes of Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh as well, who she dubbed her sea dogs. And now they were basically pirates who would go and essentially intercept and plunder ships mainly from Spain, who were traveling around to different places. And yeah, as I mentioned there, she kind of called them her sea dogs. So there's this kind of romantic notion of exploration and growth and piracy, and I suppose kind of a new influx of different things, like different spices coming into England with this kind of increased reach, this increased military reach. And the arts also thrived under Elizabeth as well, so it's kind of culturally becoming more evident as well. And England is really on the rise for the first time, arguably ever, really, but certainly for a very long time. England was really a backwater within Europe. It was really behind the likes of France and Italy and even Spain, but this is a period of tremendous growth, tremendous kind of national progress, basically. And actually this kind of continued under King James. There's turmoil actually in both of their reigns, but to an extent this continued with King James. He is probably most well known for his rendering of the Bible, but he also wrote a very famous book on kingship, which was read by many later generations. I think it's probably still in print today. It's a really interesting book on kingship. And he's also really interested in things like kind of magic and the occult and these kind of things as well. And he also wrote a book on that. I think it was called Necromancy. And so he was a kind of very scholarly king, really. And so overall, this was a tremendous kind of period for England, really, a tremendous period of growth. Now, that's not to say that it was without its issues, and it certainly was definitely at the level of like the kind of average person living in England. So this is a piece of text I wrote, just kind of own notes on this just for my classes. I think this is a nice summary here. So the Elizabethan era from 1558 to 1603 is the most dynamic, expansive and successful period England has experienced in a millennium. So prior to this, we've got over 1,000 years of not as much really going on. So Elizabeth prioritizes the navy, both official and unofficial, as I've said. They were known as privateers, pirates, the likes of Drake and Raleigh. They attacked the Spanish, the Portuguese, who themselves were actually going out and kind of plundering and establishing colonies in America and also in Africa as well. England has this growing military force, and they even famously managed to repel a really significant attack from the Spanish Armada, which set out to invade England along the east coast. And at the time, the Spanish Armada was the most powerful navy in the world, so defeating them was a tremendous source of national pride for many decades, actually. So in terms of demography, so population growth and population shifts, this is a huge period of growth. So you can see here, 1540 to 1599, the population increases by 50%, from 2.7 to 4 million. When you see those kind of population growth, you inevitably have issues related to housing and food shortages and so on, and this was no different. There was a great movement toward towns and cities, most specifically London, but with that came, these were filthy cities really, so with that came an increase in diseases, so the likes of smallpox, diphtheria, typhoid, all these things super common, killed tons of people, made people very sick. But despite all of this, we do get a kind of burgeoning middle class as well. And this is actually very important as it relates to Shakespeare. So I don't know if I'm sure you've heard the term middle class, upper class, working class, etc., etc. I won't go into the whole class system here. I probably will on a different video. But essentially a middle class person typically is somebody who has some level of education and also has some free time and spending power. Those would be three things that kind of define middle class: a kind of spending power, so economics, some education as well, and then also a little bit of leisure time as well. And so this growing middle class is kind of made up of people like clerks, business people like his father, accountants, lawyers, all these kind of positions that come into society when you have an increased level of prosperity. When you have the feudal system, you have a feudal lord, and then just most people are just peasants and labourers. There isn't really much need for clerks, lawyers. There aren't many business owners and so on. So you don't really have much of a middle class. But as that middle class develops, what usually happens, most inevitably happens, is there is an appetite for different types of consumption and luxury items and so on. But one of the main things that there is an appetite for is artistic consumption. So it's so kind of integrated into our lives on a day-to-day basis now, our own artistic consumption online, on the internet, Netflix, the cinema, books, magazines, all of this kind of consumption. But if you go back to the 16th century, I think there were maybe 200 books published per year at that point, which was actually a big increase. So there's a slightly more literate population, but the big opportunity really, I suppose, was in theatre, because you don't even need to be a great reader to go to the theatre. So we have this burgeoning middle class, and what that provides for Shakespeare is an audience. Okay, it's no good having a great play and a great cast and you don't have a real audience, or your audience is just kind of not capable of even understanding of the work that you're putting out. So this burgeoning middle class kind of provides Shakespeare with an audience. As I mentioned, writers tend to emerge from the middle class. It's very typical. Shakespeare is a case in point. His father was a glove maker in the town of Stratford. So we've already talked about his own life. I won't go over that again. But this is interesting here. So Shakespeare grew up as these tectonic shifts in English and European history were taking place. Okay, so I mentioned previously the establishment of the quote-unquote New World in America, North America, South America. the French going down into Africa, beginning their kind of colonization process, the Portuguese doing the same, the Spanish doing the same as well over in the New World. So all of this is going on. Europe is developing better technology, and so for the first time since the Roman and Greek empires, Europe is posed to overtake the Middle East and China as the world's preeminent economic and cultural force. I'm not sure that it really did overtake China economically, but it began the process, and this is something that we probably forgot in the 20th century. What we're kind of being reminded of now is that China, for most of the last 3 millennia, so the last 3,000 years, has been the preeminent economic force. It's obviously coming back now, but Europe began this process in the 16th century. Maybe it began in the 15th century, really. And the Renaissance that we talked about in the previous video began that. So this is a very, very kind of bold, dynamic, exciting time. It's a period of growth for Europe and England as well. So, as I mentioned, although there is a middle class, there is still a lot of suffering and peasantry and very squalid conditions in many of the cities. Nonetheless, this is still probably the best England has had it for a really long time. It's worth pointing out as well that we're living really in a Christian epoch. Concept of atheism, agnosticism, all these kinds of things would have been fringe at best, probably non-existent. So that's also something worth pointing out. You see in a number of Shakespeare's plays, references to Christianity, and that's just almost like referencing the air and the water in the sea. It's just taken really as a given. Also references to kind of the spiritual as well, ghosts and things like that, were much more taken kind of as a given as well. So those are just kind of some other intellectual things that are in the air. So I'll briefly mention kind of intellectual progress of Europe. The Renaissance eventually leads us to rationalism. We don't get there in Shakespeare's lifetime, but it leads us to rationalism. From rationalism, we get science, effectively. Rationalism does away with the idea that tradition or religion have authority. What has authority is logic. Instead, what has authority is logic and experimentation, and that kind of leads on to science. I'd say these are probably the two most successful intellectual movements in the history of humanity, and they've probably taken us further in the last 400 years than any other intellectual movement or religion or tradition had done in the previous 3,000. That's not to throw out those things, but we really kind of got supercharged by this process, and the Renaissance is the first step really along the road to this kind of process. It's kind of the beginning of the modern world, really. I mentioned as well, we have Cervantes over in Spain, who is the author of the first novel called Don Quixote de la Mancha. I'll just mention this here just for kind of general knowledge, if you want to, impress your Spanish exchange friends. I would say he's kind of like seen as almost like a similar cultural figure to Shakespeare. Is probably equally important in certain respects, because he really wrote the first prose novel. Concept of a novel didn't really exist. There's a few short stories and things like that. There wasn't this kind of grand novel. So this was a really important book, and it was written very much at the time of Shakespeare's life. So over in France we had Miguel de Montaigne, this guy. He's got a really cool beard actually, I'm pretty envious, who began what we call the essay form. So these essays that we have to do in school. In the 1400s, nobody had to do essays because the concept didn't exist. An essay means an attempt or a try. And Michel de Montaigne kind of invented the essay form, really, with this kind of 3 collections of essays where he basically takes a topic, breaks it down and dissects it and discusses it, and much in the same way that the modern essay does. So we have another kind of form of writing establishing itself as well at this time. Francis Bacon also took it on in England as well, but I think it's fair to say Michel de Montaigne was really at the forefront of that in France as well. So we have all of this going on in Europe, all of these exciting kind of intellectual and cultural shifts happening, and so this is a really and in criticism they call this period the early modern, because this is the birthplace really of the modern world. I'll just briefly go into some of Shakespeare's own kind of, I would say, intellectual and artistic influences as well. Now, just to go back to the kind of very overall, kind of overarching historical context, there is some friction. There is some religious friction in England between Protestants, Catholics. As human beings, we always seem to have ways to define each other and to separate off from each other in certain ways. And this was obviously a big division. And now, not long after James's coronation, he was subject to probably the most famous assassination attempt in history, in fact. And in 1605, he was subject to the gunpowder plot led by a number of conspirators. Probably the most famous name was Guy Fawkes in this plot, and it was a plot essentially of rebel Catholics who wanted to get rid of James. And so when it came to, I believe it was perhaps his coronation or some type of really significant ceremony, there was Parliament and also King James as well, all kind of meeting together for the ceremony, all kind of congregating in Parliament, and the idea was just to blow everything up, blow everything to smithereens and kill King James and actually just kind of destroy Parliament. It was quite a large conspiracy, quite a few members, and ultimately there was a leak within their own network, and the authorities came and discovered the gunpowder, and we're talking barrels and barrels and barrels of gunpowder. So it would have done, untold damage and untold destruction. And Guy Fawkes was actually there at the time, so he was, he was actually discovered at the scene. The other conspirators were kind of hunted down. I think they ended up somewhere up near York, actually, a couple of them, but they were all killed by the authorities. I think there's one who was just shot, and then others just executed pretty brutally. This could potentially have been, a true turning point in English history. Goodness knows what would have ensued afterwards, because you'd have lost the king, the head of state, and then also Parliament as well. So the whole structure, power structure and design of the country would have been completely destroyed. Some people would have probably been happy about that. Most people probably wouldn't, because it almost certainly would have plunged the country into a state of civil war and chaos. So this was a really significant event. And when we're talking about Macbeth, we look at this a little bit more closely, because it does play a significant role in Macbeth. Obviously, the story is about the successful assassination of a king. And incidentally, it was written at the time of the Gunpowder Plot and first performed very shortly afterwards, so there's a very clear connection there. So just to move finally on to kind of intellectual and artistic influences of the era. I mentioned before that Shakespeare was educated in Latin and Greek. Those were, tremendously significant influences upon him, both at the level of his writing style and then also the content as well. There's a lot of mythology referred to in his plays, and it's just kind of the air that he breathes, really. Please go away. So those are really significant influences. Other influences I would cite probably would be Ovid, the Italian poet. He was influential in terms of verse form. We've also got Plutarch as well, who was another one from poet, a thinker from that time period. And then more recently you have another similar sounding name, the Italian poet Petrarch. And he kind of, I would say, kind of invented the sonnet to a certain degree. So Shakespeare's own sonnets mirror the Petrarchan sonnet, and so that brings that particular verse form to the forefront a little bit more. And there were other influences as well. I mentioned as well Michel de Montaigne. We don't know that Shakespeare, we don't know Shakespeare's reading habits, but it seems very likely that he read Michel de Montaigne, because there's a number of passages in Montaigne that appear almost kind of word for word or just slightly adjusted and poeticized in Shakespeare's work. Montaigne was probably a significant influence. We know that the influence was from Montaigne to Shakespeare rather than the other way around, because Montaigne was printed in England where Shakespeare wasn't printed in France. So that would be another influence there. And then obviously there were kind of contemporary writers as well. And obviously there were other contemporary writers and other influences as well, but those are just some of the most kind of significant ones you might want to be aware of. Okay, so I would say this is probably enough information for a GCSE student who really wants to delve into the history, the biography, and the intellectual, cultural, and historical, political influences that are shaping Shakespeare's thought, shaping his work, and kind of feeding back into his work. The reason it is useful to know this information is because you want to know what the context is. You want to be able to situate the plays, because otherwise sometimes they just kind of seem a little bit out there on their own. And so it's good to be able to situate things historically and culturally as well. Another point as well is if you're quite a high scoring candidate, you're really aiming for those top grades, what you want to do is, reference contextual knowledge in your answer. Okay, so you don't want to focus on it exclusively and just start talking about Shakespeare's marriage to Anne Hathaway. That's not really going to get you very far. But what you want to do is you want to reference all of this contextual knowledge, just peppering it in here and there, where it seems it's actually going to add a little bit more depth and finesse to your answer. So a skilled candidate, and I'm talking someone really going probably for a 7, 8, 9, is going to just subtly reference contextual knowledge here and there. So in these two videos I've given you quite a bit of contextual knowledge, and I think this is a good starting point for a GCSE candidate. These videos are quite long, and I'm perfectly fine with that, because this is a resource, this is a learning resource. This is not really a YouTube video trying to get loads of hits. So hopefully you benefited from it. Obviously it's here, you can look back at it, revise again. I would probably suggest taking notes and maybe just bullet pointing maybe 10 key points from each of these videos you can then take away with you and take forward and reference in these questions. Okay, so next up I'm going to take a look at one or two of the plays themselves. But I thought this was a really important video to do. I think it's something that's slightly undercooked in many students' kind of education and knowledge, but it's something that can really add that extra level to your answers. Okay, so I feel confident this is going to be something that you can use, is going to be useful to you. So I will leave you with that.